Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. Way of the Blade, written by Speedhump23. Seavorth is a Blade Master. A Blade Master is one of the highly trained leaders of the scouting parties launching the initial attacks on the third planet of the Yellow Sun system. Today had been a strange day. His initial response to his lord's question of, "Where is half your unit?" had not been met well. Bowing and exposing his neck to the Battle Lord, the overall commander in charge of subjugating this planet, Seavorth waited for the ornate blade his lord carried to nick his neck. A slow and painful death could await him as he slowly bled out. Only the will of the gods would stop the bleeding. As he waited, he wished for the chance to expand his purport. It would mean life and death, or probably future victories for his people. If he got permission to speak before the blade nicked his hide, the blade paused. "Explain your defeat." Seavorth's party had landed without being seen by any of the locals. Their optically cloaked scoutcraft had landed just outside a small town, away from the brightly loud area. The translator deciphered the local script on the metal sign on the outskirts of the town. It said, "Welcome to Fredericksburg, Texas. Try our beer." Scanning as they descended, Seavorth confirmed again that the optical transmission seemed to be limited to illumination only. These poor beings did not even have long-range optical blast communication. This would be a walkover. The building they had selected for the demonstration seemed to have 30 of the locals inside, seated and standing, and a lot of optical and audio noises coming from the entrances. Several of their ground transports were located outside, many with brightly colored signs on them, obviously flags of a familiar alliance. It was odd to see so many different family groups gathered together in such a remote location, unless it must be a wedding or bonding of families. Seavorth's unit decloaked at the entrances, moving in as well-trained unit they were. The screams were to be expected. Good. They were in awe of the monoblades held by his forces. The translator held by Seavorth's second started broadcasting the pre-recorded optical flashes of subjugation in the universal language, telling the locals about the invasion and about the terms of the blade demonstration. The multiple explosions which tore Seavorth's second part were more than his ears could deal with. Seavorth managed to keep standing, but several of his unit lost eardrums to the sounds, two falling to the ground in pain and shock. Retreating from the building, the scout unit left 3 behind, a dishonor that would stain his life for a long or short time to come. Retreating to their ship, one of the unit forgot to re-engage their cloak, and just fell apart as the explosions came from the building. Whatever had happened, the Battle Lord must be told. Launching from the car park, the ship was moving so fast, it went straight past the 2 circling jets who had been scrambled from a nearby airfield to investigate the unidentified object seen falling towards the town. Summary of the Way of the Blade Data Review Imperatus Period 25-548-2. Blades are the most terrifying weapon in the explored galaxy. No being wants to have to try and deal with a cut from a war blade. The slow or fast loss of vital fluids leads to a painful death unless the gods decide to help. A serious cut is beyond even the help of the gods and always leads to death. Some invasions have finished with just an explanation party demonstrating their blade's power to cut deep through the defending forces' shields. Attacking uninformed planets was always a trial, which is why the scout forces would find random areas to test their blades on the poor population. The news of the scouting attack would spread panic amongst the population, and the invasion could proceed as normal. Standing behind Seavorth as he bowed his neck, Feck expected his report to be received with similar response from the Battle Lord. Well, it was true that the Feck scout unit had been all returned. They all had failed to successfully demonstrate their blade's power to the simple group that they had selected. The response the locals had delivered had terrified the Feck to the core, and he hoped the Battle Lord would not kill him on hearing it. The Feck's unit had landed in the northern end of one of the southern landmasses, selecting a small settlement. They had approached the mid-sun period. The cloaked scouts had started by surrounding the structures with the most people in it. The structure had several very dusty ground vehicles around the outside, each with a small crew cab at front and a flat area, probably for cargo, at the rear. Small four-limbed animals had been sitting in many of the cargo areas, but the cloaks worn by the scouts had hidden them from even these animals' senses. Although the smaller four-limbed animals, which had been hissing at the chained-up larger animal, had looked right at him, hissed, and then walked back to sit in the shade under a transport. The FEPS unit had decloaked after surrounding the humanoids. The translator package had started flashing the blade message, and the locals had dropped their small black spheres that they were rolling across the green ground to stare at the unit. One local had started yelling at the scout, who had the decloaked on the green grass, yelling at him while pointing at his clawed feet. The motions were to move him off the grass. The FEP could not understand it. The scout was a good 20% taller than the possibly female and quite old local who was dressed in white. She showed no fear of the blade. Was this some sort of religious activity? All the people on the green surface were in white. The FEP told these scouts to move off the green surface so as to not offend the local gods. As scouts leader, he did not want to offend the locals before they were subdued. He turned to his second and told him to replay the message. In time, the flashes from the messages, the unit displayed their finger-long blades shining in the light, turning the metal of the razor-sharp blades to shine reflected sunlight on the locals. The blades were shaped to play the sounds of victory with the pulsed light waves coming off of them. This display of their blades had subjugated dozens of worlds in the past. The display of polished metal showing the molecular thin blades which could cut anything. It seemed that none of the locals could understand the Song of Victory, but a few were looking at the second and turning their heads to actually putting dark lenses across their eyes, possibly in an attempt to shield themselves from the terrifying blade display. Some were even turning heads from the message. The optical track looped again, yet none of the locals seemed to understand what was going on. Realizing that these locals must be some sort of partially blind religious cult, the FEP looked around and tried to find a warrior to demonstrate the blade song and secure a surrender for these landmass. As he looked around, the glass doors on the side of the building beside the grass area opened. The local that walked out was dressed differently to the religious caste. This local looked to be a worker. He was dusty, had a covering on his head and well-worn clothes, stopped just at the edge of the green religious area. The worker looked at the FEP's impressive scout group. Locals would always cower when seeing the sight of the scout party for the first time. The bright yellow fur, with black and green battle dress protecting the vital parts of the scouts from the sharpest blades. The local worker looked from one scout to the other, looking at the blades carried by the scouts shining in the sunlight, watching as the optical message for the demand for surrender was played again and again, calling on them to surrender, or the use of blades would be allowed. The message flashed the warning that the defeated locals would become slaves for the Empire or be cut and left to die slowly of fluid loss. Walking towards the FEP, the local looked at the blade in his hand and then did something which would haunt the leader for the rest of his life. He did what could only be described as he laughed, and he spoke something to the scout leader. Odd-Eth was the aide to the Battle Lord. This was an honorable task for one as young as she was. Her clan had helped to produce some of the finest battle dresses for generations, and this work had allowed her the honor to aid the commander. Her main job was to record the reports of victory from the scouts, a task that she had completed many times before. Today, this job was taking a different turn. The report from the scout leader, Sir Voth, described locals not even waiting for surrender message to be played before somehow killing half the scouts and injuring most of the rest of the unit. The images captured by the unit's armor showed small devices being pointed at the second within moments of him decloaking and starting the broadcast. The bright flashes from the explosions wiped out the optical recorders, but they did give him a hint of something. Odd-Eth thought that it must be a noise-generating device, causing the eardrums of the scouts to rupture, and the second must have died when the broadcaster overloaded due to the optical input. The report from the FEP was one that she would hope to tell her family, unless the Battlelord killed her to keep his defeats secret. There had never been such a response to a blade display before. It had been honed through hundreds of displays, and the scouts practiced the moves for years before they were allowed to use it in battle. The locals not only seemed to rebuff the demands, but had not seemingly informed others of their interactions with the scouts. The lack of long-range communications was a mystery. Some small coherent lights were noticed being used in space, but no optical flash communications at all. Were these locals so blind that they could not see high-spectrum lights? They seemed to rely entirely on wired communication, and some other method a Battlelord scientist could not understand. For their distance communication, the satellites which had been retrieved for examination seemed to have many cameras, but the dish-shaped objects on them were causing the technicians so many sleepless nights. The Battlelord's deliberations on the fate of Seavoth and Defep were interrupted by the proximity alarms. A small ship approaching the flagship was totally dark, with no running lights on it at all. It was only lucky observation from a technician that detected the object on the optical scanners. The surface of the craft had obscured a distant star, which had triggered the alarm. Parking in front of the battleship, the small craft started to flash a small beam of light at the flagship. It was counting basic numbers and then complex ones. The flagship computers took over communications and after several rotations announced that their language had been deciphered. The standard decree of death by blade was transmitted, which caused a pause in the communication, then a few follow-up questions about exactly what they meant. It turned out that the locals exclusively used sound wave vibration instead of optical flash to communicate between themselves, and radio waves from distant communication. While all races could hear, light flash communication was superior, and the race of the blade often forgot other methods existed. The Battlelord looked at the translated display of the message. "We apologize for the deaths of several of your first contact team. It was in no way an official response from our government or planet. The locals were surprised by the sudden appearance of your unit and reacted out of fear. The response from the Australians to your team are also apologized for. The person who mocked your scout leader has been disciplined and told to put it in the future. Examining the recording of your messages, we feel trade treaty may be better for you than an invasion. We offer access to knowledge that you do not have, such as medical procedures to close wounds, as well as ranged weaponry. For defensive purposes, of course, we hope to hear from you soon, but are prepared to respond if you continue to attack our planet." The Battlelord turned to Defep and asked him again what an Australian had said. Lifting his head, Defep just said, "With the aid of a new translation, it makes more sense now. The warrior caste came out of the building. He looked at our battle blades, and according to the translation said, 'That's not a knife,' and then drew a huge blade almost as long as my arm and said, 'This is a knife.' Then cut my battle harness. I think, we should take the trade deal." End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barkey, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakul, and Arcadian.